Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. Lots of big news breaking this morning from overseas. In particular, Russia is warning that Ukraine may use a dirty bomb on their own territory. Of course, no one thinks that makes sense, but it is ominous nonetheless, so we will break all of that down. Also, some pretty interesting mysteries from Xi Jinping's new, ascension, his reacclimation, some weird things going on there. We will also break down that and what that might mean. New polling in terms of the midterms. We have increasingly clear picture of the midterms shifting back towards the GOP, mainstream media finally taking notice. We also have extraordinarily high interest in the midterms, voters turning out already in record numbers in the early voting period. What does that mean? Anybody's guess at this point. We also are taking a look at a mixed bag in terms of student debt relief and how it's faring in the courts. Some wins for the Biden administration, one big loss or challenge. There has been an injunction put in place so that people cannot get relief until these matters are resolved. So we will tell you all about that. And also the Biden White House continuing to be in sort of denial about how the economy is actually going for people.
Joke.
Yes, indeed. Saagar is taking a deep look at China. I am taking a look at the GOP's potentially catastrophic economic plans. But we did want to start with the news out of Ukraine.
That's right. Okay, let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. There's a lot of developments in the last 24 hours. So first and foremost is the Russian defense minister held calls with several NATO heads of defense. And here's what he said, Sergei Shoigu. He said that there was a, quote, unproven claim in his phone conversations with several defense secretaries that Ukraine was going to use a dirty bomb on its own territory. The claim being that Ukrainians are manufacturing some sort of event in order to precipitate NATO involvement. Now, as many pointed out, that also would precipitate possible Russian escalation. So they certainly have an interest in doing so. The point being that tensions are probably higher today than they have been in quite a long time. One of the things that a lot of us took notice here in Washington, let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen, is that there were actually two separate phone calls between the head of the Russian military and Lloyd Austin, our own defense secretary. That was the second of two phone calls in just a matter of days. And Krystal, that is the first time that the two had spoken since the outbreak of the war itself. Here's a readout from the Russian side. They say, quote, heads of defense departments discussed the situation in Ukraine. Shoigu spoke with counterpoints from France, Turkey, and the United Kingdom. Notably, all of those are NATO allies, and all of them have had a pretty big role in trying to have any of the nascent negotiations in the early days they were involved. This morning, there was also a joint statement that was put out by all of the NATO heads of secretaries of state. Now, what they said there, Krystal, is that they were pushing back against the so-called claim around the dirty bombs.
Yeah.
It was a joint statement between the U.S., Britain, and France. Notably, Turkey was left off of that. And here's exactly what they say. They say that the defense ministers had all spoken and confirmed those calls. They say that the world would see through any attempt to use this allegation as a pretext for escalation. So that is why it all matters. Our own State Department put it out and says, we, the foreign ministers of France, the United Kingdom, and the United States, reiterate our steadfast support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in the face of Russia's ongoing aggression. We remain committed to continue supporting Ukraine's efforts to defend its territory. Earlier today, they confirmed that. Our countries made clear we all reject Russia's transparently false allegations that Ukraine is preparing to use a dirty bomb on its own territory. The world would see through any of the attempt. We further reject any pretext for escalation by Russia. The foreign ministers also discussed their shared determination to continue supporting Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. So why does that matter? Obviously, this seems to be in a very, very tense event. It would not be outside of the Russian playbook to facilitate some sort of quote unquote false flag operation. And, according to them, they may not even need any so-called false flag, Krystal. They could just claim that they have intelligence showing that, which is the pretext for a further type of strike, a further invasion. Obviously, all eyes right now on Belarus and the Russian massing of troops that are there on the border, northern border of Ukraine. We have no idea how many troops there are. Some leaks, some intelligence analysts say it could be as small as 10,000. It could also be tens of thousands. We have very, very little insight into what's happening. All we know is that the situation is tense enough where I think it's incredibly noteworthy that the Russian defense minister, in his very first call, is basically pushing this on all of the NATO defense ministers, in effect, kind of giving them almost a little bit of a warning. We don't exactly know what was said, but like we said, to watch this situation very closely. It comes on the heels of Nord Stream and also on the heels of the Crimean Bridge attack.
Yeah, and on the heels of them threatening use of nuclear weapons.
Right.
So, I mean, that's the backdrop for all of this is this the pretext that they're going to use with their own population to justify the use of a quote-unquote tactical nuclear weapon or at least quote-unquote some kind of nuclear test? I mean, that's the really terrifying scenario. And I think that has to be what US, UK, and France are all thinking when they're putting out this joint communication saying, we see through your lies. None of us is going to fall for this whatsoever and we see through what you're doing here. I think the most that we can say at this point is that something is going on. And the way that we know that for sure is we haven't had communication at this level of our government and Russia's government for a long time. I really don't know the last time that the defense ministers spoke. I think it was before the war.
Right.
They spoke twice in a matter of days. And it was explicitly at the request of Shoigu, the Russian defense minister. And it was obviously explicitly to convey this sort of ominous warning/threat. What does it mean? Where does it lead? No one knows. I think all we can say at this point, it is extremely unnerving and a very ominous situation.
Yeah, one quote I wanted to highlight is that Shoigu, in his readout from his speech, from his talk with the French defense minister, here's what he said. They discussed the situation in Ukraine, which is rapidly deteriorating. It is trending towards further uncontrolled escalation. So they are using a pretext, possibly, of a so-called dirty bomb. They are warning of further uncontrolled escalation. It does not escape us that this is the first major diplomatic contact between the two nations in months, and to have the circumstances of this be confirmed by all of the NATO defense ministers who spoke with them and all united in saying, hey, we would reject any pretext of this as quote-unquote further escalation, we should be worried. We do not know what that quote-unquote escalation could look like. It could be a redux of the drone attacks, which we'll talk about in a little bit, on their critical infrastructure, which has wreaked havoc on Ukraine's energy. It could be more missile strikes that we've seen previously. It could involve Belarus. And then the nightmare scenario is that it involves tactical nuclear weapons. The first one that we had called, the defense minister of the UK, in his initial call, put out the statement, put it up there on the screen, because he makes it clear what you said. At the request of the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Secretary of State for Defense spoke with his Russian counterpart this afternoon. So this was a call precipitated by the Russians. Now, with Shoigu, too, there's been a lot of Kremlinology in analyzing what's going on with this guy. He was inside Putin's circle, and yet, Krystal, he has not been seen publicly in a while. Now, he was at the so-called annexation, but he was not at the latest speech where Putin was talking about escalation post-annexation. Kremlinologists were looking at that and were like, maybe Shoigu is out of favor. Maybe he's the fall guy. The point being that Shoigu has his back against the wall. He clearly is going to have some blame for this, both from Putin and from the Russian public. They need a fall guy just like everybody does.
Right.
And so he really is in a tight spot. And Putin really has him in a situation where he's going to say, you have to be my front man for anything that I'm going to be doing. Our fates are intertwined. And if you don't do a good job, I'll either have you killed or, you're going to get fired and eventually fall out of a window or something like that. But my point is that Shoigu himself is also in a precarious situation when he's going through these phone calls.
There's a couple other things to say here. I mean, first of all, just to explain what a dirty bomb actually is.
Right.
It's a device that uses explosives to scatter radioactive waste, doesn't have the impact of a nuclear weapon, but could still expose large areas to radioactive contamination, which again is why there's a lot of skepticism that Ukraine would be looking to launch one of these on their own soil, which could potentially impact their own people. We also should consider the broader context here of course, how is Russia faring in the war right now? And we're going to get into a little bit more of this in a moment. But as we reported to you last week, it looks like they are preparing to lose Kherson, which is one of the first major cities that they were able to claim in this war. That would be yet another stunning defeat. You see desperate moves like the official imposition of martial law in the 4 illegally annexed territories and a sort of like maybe sort of kind of martial law in other parts of Russia. Of course, we had the mass mobilization of several 100,000 Russians, as best we can tell. And of course, that resulted in a lot of domestic upheaval and many military-age men either fleeing the country or basically going into hiding. So they're in a very difficult situation. We also should keep in mind that they have a new, much harder line general in charge of this effort. And since then, that's when we've seen, the strikes on Kyiv again, the strikes on infrastructure, these more sort of, all-in and brutal tactics to terrorize the population, even as it has not actually changed their ability to win on the battlefield. So that's the context in which this call comes in, and part of why it is such a frightening situation.
Yeah, and that's just what I think we should underscore in this segment, which is that it's a tense situation as to how exactly these things go. Could be weeks, could be days. We really have no idea. This is exactly the type of stuff they were doing right before the invasion of Ukraine.
Right.
It's not lost that false flags precipitated the Nazi invasion of Russia, many other Russian invasions and or escalations in the past. False flags have precipitated escalations here in the United States. The point being that this is a time-honored, unfortunate tradition, and even if everybody knows it's BS, that doesn't always stop the belligerent from just sticking with it and selling their own populace. So lots of scrutiny that should be paid to this, but I do take it very seriously in the context of Nord Stream and especially the Crimean escalation, the Crimean Bridge, and then the missile attack. Things are all trending in a scarier direction.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.